For today's episode, we're going to talk about something that I struggle with. I have struggled with a lot in my past. I'm getting better, but obviously it's an ongoing process. And that is that it's not an act of kindness to make it easy for people to have access to you. This is specifically for those of us who identify as people pleasers. We probably have been conditioned to believe throughout our childhood or upbringing that the kindest thing we can do for others is give ourselves. That people only want us when we are useful, when we can provide something, when they can have access to us. That is our utility. That's the only reason we exist. Obviously, that's a very dark, intense belief to have, but I think it is prominent in those of us who identify as people pleasers. It's not true, of course, but when you are really in that headspace and that mindset, it can be hard to realize that giving people access to you easily, like making it super easy for people to have access to you, not having boundaries, not having limitations, or being able to say no, or I don't like this, whatever, is not an act of kindness towards them. It is not you being nice and caring and loving towards them. It's actually an act of unkindness towards them and to you. Because what this says, and this is something I've had to really reframe for myself in my own mind when I feel this impulse. When you do that, what you're saying about yourself, first of all, is that you don't believe you deserve to have boundaries. You don't believe that people will adhere to those boundaries. You don't believe that you are worthy of having people in your life if you're not useful to them in some way, or if they can't have access to you, then they'll leave. You'll be abandoned. But what it's also saying about the other people that you think you're being kind towards, that you're showing acts of love towards, what you're saying about them is that you think they are people that won't want to adhere to your boundaries, that they don't want people or friends or partners, whoever in their lives that have boundaries, that have the ability to say no or have dislikes that they can express. You're also saying that they are only interested in having relationships that are convenient and useful for them. That's not nice to think about another person. That's not very kind. That's not very respectful to think about the other person. When I realized that, and that's what I was essentially saying about the people in my life that I thought had to have this easy access to me, I realized that I'm actually not as kind as I think I am. And that ties into the concept of people pleasing not really being you being kind. It's not an act of kindness. People pleasing is a form of manipulation. And it's obviously coming from a place of deep fear, right? And wanting to be safe. It's not malicious manipulation. So, don't blame yourself or shame yourself for it. It's just what we've been taught to use as a form of survival and being okay and being safe. But when I realized that and tied it into this idea of people pleasing being manipulation, I realized that, oh yeah, I'm not being kind here. I'm being manipulative. I'm using my utility as a way to have love, care, consideration, relationships, not knowing it, right? It was not obvious to me at the time, but now I look back and I'm like, oh yeah, no, it wasn't coming from a kind place, because to lower your boundaries and allow people in easily, people who might not necessarily be good for you to allow into your life and into your space, is not kind to you first and foremost. So if you can't be kind to yourself first, it's so much harder to recognize what is kindness to someone else, to the people you actually care about in your life. If you, the person you spend the majority of your life, all of your life with, not even the majority, all of your life with, if you can't even be kind to you and understand what kindness feels like for you, and you actually show yourself a lot of unkindness by allowing people in who might not be good for you, you're not going to know what that's like for someone else. So you're going to also project that same behavior and those same beliefs onto another person. And some of those people maybe are in it for, their easy access to you. Maybe they do want relationships that are convenient and useful. But there might also be people in your life that aren't at all like that don't believe those things, that don't only want relationships that are convenient and easy, quote unquote, or useful for them. That's not kind to them. And imagine being in the shoes of somebody like that. Imagine being in the other person's position where your friend believes that you won't want to hear their boundaries, that you won't respect it, you won't adhere to it, that you're only interested in them because of their use and value. How painful is that to think of your friend thinking that about you, right? It feels like they are not really seeing you, that they're missing you, that they're not understanding you, and that they don't want to understand you. Like, that's painful, right? So I use that as a way to remind myself in those moments too. When I feel that impulse to make myself easily accessible for people, I realize it's not kind for anybody in the situation for me to do that. It also doesn't help you weed out people who are actually good for you, who want to be there. You have to weed out the people that aren't at all healthy people to have in your life. That's the only way you can do that, is by not making it easy to have access to you. You have to make it difficult. You have to kind of make it like you're jumping, like they have to jump through hoops. Obviously, this doesn't mean being forcefully difficult, right? Not pushing people away. That's not what I mean at all. It doesn't mean being mean or aggressive or angry or whatever to make sure that nobody comes close to you. That defeats the purpose. The purpose here is to find meaningful, intentional connection and aligned connection. But you can't make it easy for just anybody to be able to have access to you in that way, because then that almost in a sense devalues your sense of self to being accessible no matter how someone behaves. And that's not nice. That's not kind. You're going to lose your self-trust when you do that. And again, I say this from my own experience as well, like things I've had to work on in therapy. You lose self-trust when you allow someone in who does not necessarily belong in your life, because they won't adhere to your boundaries, because they are acting in ways that are not aligned with, that don't feel good for you, that don't feel safe for you, but you've let them in. What message is that sending to you? It's sending a message that you are unsafe for yourself, that you will let anybody in, even if they're threatening in some way, maybe physically, emotionally, whatever. Again, I don't want to make this a shameful, blaming thing, because this is just what we're conditioned to believe is the only way to survive, to have connection, to be worthy of it. But it's important to recognize that this is not what kindness and love actually looks like. Love is not easy, quote unquote. It's not supposed to be something that you are willing to give away regardless of whether or not somebody is showing up in a way that feels good and safe for you. And I know it's scary, because then you're like, well, what if I'm lonely after? What if nobody wants to stay in my life? What if I'm alone forever? I know that's the deep core fear that all of us have. Of course, that's like such a human fear, but it's also not true. It's not true. And all it takes is one person to stay in your life, to want to be there, regardless of the boundaries you have, to prove to you that it's not true. And you need to let that happen. You need to let yourself gain that proof to change that paradigm you have. But the only way to let yourself get that proof is to start setting those boundaries, start making it more difficult for people to have access to you, so you can see who's actually willing to be there and who likes the fact that you have boundaries, who likes that it's not easy to have access to you. Not in like a challenge type of way, because I think that's like a whole other situation, right? Where someone likes the chase, or they like that it's hard to get something, and then when they get it, they don't want it anymore. And we're not talking about that. That's a whole different story. I'm talking about people who are happy to see that you respect yourself enough to have those boundaries, to have those limitations, to have the limited access to you, because also it makes them feel good too, to know like, oh wow, yeah, this person cares about themselves, and they realize that I am a person who will also care about them in the same way, right? That they're allowing me in because they can see that I am an aligned person for them, not just because they allow everybody in, you know? And again, this isn't to shame who you want to bring into your life, why you want to bring them in. Obviously, like, you can do whatever you want. There's nothing inherently right or wrong, good or bad about it, or morally right or wrong about it. It's just for you. It's just for you to recognize what feels good for you, and to not confuse easy access to you as love and care and kindness for somebody else. The two are mutually exclusive. They can be completely different. Not always, but a lot of the time, yeah. And especially for those of us who are people pleasers, right? This is specifically from the perspective of somebody who's been conditioned to believe that the only value and worth they have is their easy access. That's it. And that's not kind to you. And that's not true. It's not true. But the more you allow that to happen, the more you allow people in who don't respect your boundaries, who don't respect you emotionally, physically, mentally, whatever, the more you're reinforcing that belief that, oh yeah, the only reason people like me is because they have easy access to me, that I have no boundaries. And so you'll continue to believe it, right? It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy after a while, because you have no evidence to counteract it. We do have to go out and get that evidence. And it's very difficult. Don't get me wrong. It's easier said than done. It's scary. You do have to risk loneliness at times. You do have to risk certain relationships and friendships. Totally. That is part of the process. And it's not easy. So I don't want to say that you have to just get over it and it should be easy for you. It's very scary. It requires bravery, and it requires a lot of self-trust. But that self-trust can only happen when you take that risk and show yourself that like you're banking on yourself, that you're taking a chance on yourself, and you're going to have your own back regardless of who stays and who doesn't. So yeah, I hope this was helpful. I hope it was informative. I hope it gave you a different perspective on this. Again, it's something I have to remind myself of often, to not confuse kindness and love for having easy access to you. If you want to talk about these things in more detail with me, feel free to book a one-to-one call on my website. You can subscribe to my Substack if you want to read about these topics. And follow me on Instagram and TikTok for the rest of my content. Other than that, thank you for listening, and I'll be back again soon with another episode.